Hello, everyone. My name is DariusStevens, and today I'm going to be presenting on the paper called Using Large Language Models to Understand Suicidality in a Social Media Based Taxonomy of Mental Health Disorders, a linguistic analysis of Reddit post. To give us a little bit of background, over 49,000 people died by suicide in 2022. That equates to about one death every 11 minutes. This information is provided by the CDC, and from it, we can see that suicide is a major problem in America. So here lies the problem. Despite many advances in mental health awareness, treatment, prevention strategies over the last 50 years, there has been a lack of significant improvement in suicide risk. And it still, like I said before, remains a very big public health issue. In order to offer a solution to this problem, this paper states that its objective is to use large language models to understand natural language use during public web-based discussions on Reddit around topics related to suicidality. However, from my interpretation of this paper, I believe it gives shape and insight to suicidality against various mental health topics. It provides this information based on discussions held by users within a public web-based forum. In this case, it's Reddit. And one key feature about this information is it's unbiased by any pre-existing metadata or any pre-existing scientific theory. As far as data selection and pre-processing, this slide focuses on Reddit and why the researchers chose to use it. So the paper states that some of the past risk factors for accuracy in previous research as being potential sampling bias, as well as structured clinical interviews and surveys, and also a lab-based setting. And so this led the researchers to choosing Reddit. The paper states that they felt that Reddit facilitates a natural use of language. The users are usually going and, they're reaching out on their own accord to find help or to discuss matters around suicide. Also, it's a natural setting because, again, these people are at home, usually from their computers or phones. Also, the size of the user base. The paper states that Reddit has over 400,000 users, but according to backlinko.com, they state in one of their most recent posts that Reddit has 97.2 million daily active users. And so just from the sheer size of the user base, you can see that it's a large pool of data that the researchers will be able to pull from. So that's the last reason that they chose to use Reddit. As far as the actual data selection, the researchers chose posts from a list of subreddits from October 1st to December 31st, 2022, and from that same time frame in 2010. They chose 16 subreddits related to mental health and 14 subreddits that were non-health related. It comprised of 2.9 million posts that were taken and analyzed. And the main reason that they used the 2010 data was to establish stability of features within the research. As far as pre-processing, they used a Python environment to process the data, and they basically removed all empty posts and all posts containing just a question mark. Things of that, posts like that were all removed. The overall method. The researchers used sentence embedding to extract latent linguistic dimensions of user postings from the different subreddits. So basically, they had a lot of dimensions when this information was extracted. This was a concept that was a little hard for me to understand at first, especially as I was first reading through the paper, just because it's impossible to see anything higher than 3 dimensions. However, the researchers then applied dimensionality reduction to these sentence embeddings and allowed them to be summarized and visualized in a 3 dimensional space. So the steps involved are as followed. Step one, present the post in the latent space of large language model embeddings. Step two, compute a representation for each subreddit, averaging all its posts. Step three, compute different metrics of the structure of the subreddits within the embedding space. And step four, apply interpretation techniques to these structural metrics to obtain insights about the relationship between suicidality and other subreddits or self-identified groups. This paper presents the techniques that were used throughout the various stages within this research. I found that the way that the researchers laid out these techniques to be confusing. So in order to give context to the techniques and in order to give structure to my presentation, I present the techniques based on what steps they were performed in. So with that, steps 1 and 2 involve large language model embedding. The researchers use semantic text embedding, which basically assigns a numerical vector to each text and enable texts that are similar in meaning or context to be closer within a space. The researchers used an advanced form of text embedding called BERT. And BERT is a system developed by Google that looks at bi-directional representation of the text and essentially improves the understanding of that text. In step three, the research uses mathematical techniques based on where the subreddit posts were located within the embedding space. And they use this to find similarity amongst the subreddits. So as you can see from the first graph on the left, Suicide Watch, over 40% of those posts were centered around the centroid, which is a feature of clustering, but they were basically situated within a closer space to each other as opposed to the other subreddit topics. And then on the left, you have the suicide related post and how close those topics relate to other topics. So as you can see in the top left corners, you have suicide and depression. And that pathway is wider, leading from suicide to depression. And that is because it's a strong link between, or the research found a strong link between suicide and depression. The researchers use hierarchical clustering in step three to give insights to the underlying patterns and groupings of the different mental health disorders. They did this by using the word linkage method, which is basically a mathematical equation that merge the closest pair of clusters. This process creates visually what is known as a dendrogram. Here you have a dendrogram where the x-axis represents the distance between the combined clusters. So you can see at the point when two clusters combine, which are the red dots, the further out you go or the further to the left you go, the further those clusters get away from each other. In step four, the researchers use singular value decomposition, or SVD, to reduce the dimensions. And they basically use the first three SVD components to determine and map the subreddits on a 3D space. Also in step 4, the researchers used generative large language modeling to provide insights into the patterns of the SVD components. They use various models to engage in an interactive dialogue with GPT-4 and basically ask the model different questions and also present the model with different data. The researchers identified the top and bottom 5 embedding positions of the 3 dimensions of the SVD components, and they came up with about 30 extreme postings. They fed this information to the model, and then they asked the following questions, highlighted in blue, in order to give context to the different posts. Lastly, in step 4, the researchers used explainable AI as a form of validation. They used a technique called photo dash, where they were able to choose the posts that best represented the total data set. What they found were 5 posts. They then fed these posts to ChatGPT and were able to gain semantic insight into the data. Here's a 2D representation for the process in step 4. In the green, you have the extreme postings. Those were being fed to GPT to get semantic insight. And then you also have in orange the prototypical postings, or the postings found by PhotoDash. And those were fed to GPT to get a summary as well. Here is what ChatGPT found from the extreme postings that were fed to the model. As far as SVD1, the theme was emotional well-being, ranging from despair to resilience. In SVD2, seeking understanding and support was the theme, and it ranged from closing in to reaching out. And then lastly, SVD3, you have the severity of distress, which is basically low to high. Underneath each one of those themes, they basically just give you an overview of the height of it versus the low. The researchers further broke down the 3D space to a 2-dimensional space, a 2-dimensional graph, in order to give the readers a better view of the information being presented. So here you have SVD1 along the x-axis being compared to SVD2 along the y-axis. What's important to note is that all mental health subreddits fall on the negative side of SVD1, which again is that emotional well-being, which makes sense being that these are mental health disorders. Here you have the 2D representation of SVD2 as well as SVD3. You also have highlighted in blue, the blue dot is where suicide watch falls on these different components. The discussion laid out by the research paper highlights that suicide watch post had the highest value for seeking advice. This kind of shows that previous techniques might be outdated and not very useful, which is why these people are seeking help on Reddit. It also alludes to a therapy-like process that may be taking place upon Reddit, where people are searching for validation as well as solutions. Also, PhotoDash and GPT-4 analytics support contemporary theories about suicide and what leads to suicide. And then lastly, the clustering of subreddits support a more recent statistically driven classification system, which is called the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology. And there are just a few slight differences from the research and that classification system. The research limitations include the data being limited to a 3-month period, the data solely focusing on Reddit, and the exclusion of established measures for suicide risk or clinical judgment. As far as the future direction, the time frame would need to be expanded, as well as other web-based platforms need to be explored with the use of additional data sources, and also to incorporate multiple scientific perspective to gain more comprehension. What I found interesting about the research is that all of the different mental health conditions have some type of overlap. I found it very insightful that machine learning techniques as well as AI can be used in this arena and give shape to the different mental health conditions. Lastly, the thing that stood out to me the most is technology is just a powerful tool that can be used to bridge the gap for people from many different backgrounds. In this case, it can be used to connect people with different mental health issues and ultimately make the human experience better. So with that, this is the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank you all for listening.